Welcome everyone to another episode of the JPM podcast. Today, we are very lucky to be joined by both Dr. Rubin and Dr. Welton, who have given their time to talk a little bit about how to navigate residency from a halachic perspective. I want to give a few disclaimers and kind of set the stage of exactly what we're discussing today. So first off, I want to point out that although we're talking about Non Shabbos residency, we're not here to give halachic advice saying, take a Non Shabbos residency, it's completely fine. That's obviously not what we're coming to do. We have lots of videos about taking a Non Shabbos residency and about how to make Shabbos accommodating programs, like how to apply for programs. We have our database of programs that are willing to work with you. This is really a personal choice and a choice that you should really discuss with a POSIC. But unfortunately, many of us will likely find ourselves in a non-Shabbos accommodating program. So we wanted to discuss with people who have gone through it some advice, tips, some struggles they've gone through. So that's the point of today's discussion. So a little bit of a plug, you can listen to our talks with various poskim on the topic of whether or not you should take one and if it's allowed and how one can operate in the hospital in accordance with halacha as much as possible. And like I said, we have our database. It's important to realize there are fields of medicine that are much more accommodating for Shabbos than other fields. So all that being said, that's the kind of the background. And today we're, like I said, we're lucky enough to be joined by both Dr. Welton and Dr. Rubin. Dr. Welton is a PGY2 at Mount Sinai, South Nassau. Dr. Rubin did his internal medicine residency at Columbia and did his pulmonary critical care at Mass General. He also did bioethics at Harvard, although I don't think that's going to be of much discussion today. Correct me if I'm wrong. We could discuss that another time. Both of them are really kind and don't generally like to go by doctor. So it's Chavi and Yonah as far as I know. But if you reach out to them, please be appropriate and refer to them as doctor and give them the proper respect. And we're very appreciative that they came on today to share their thoughts. Okay. Is there anything that any of you want to share before we begin? You have a list of questions that we intend of asking. Is there any kind of background you want to share before we jump right in? Okay. So I think the first thing to really start off the conversation is, like I've mentioned, we've talked with poskim about doing Shabbos accommodating programs. There are programs that are, will fully take care of Shabbos. And one of the things that came out was really that the thinking of Shabbos is one of the underlying features of something we should think about when we're picking a residency. So obviously we think about money, we think about lifestyle. And when you think about lifestyle, Shabbos is obviously something that's really important. And so it's really on top of the list. So the two of you ended up in non-Shabbos accommodating programs and some fields of medicine that in general are not accommodating for Shabbos. How did you, each of you, and we'll go one by one. We'll start with Dr. Rubin and then we'll reverse. How did you kind of come to the conclusion that being off from, away from your family on Shabbos or having to struggle with Shabbos was still something that you wanted to do throughout your career? How did you come to the conclusion that the career you chose, although it kind of conflicts with Shabbos, is still kind of your best life?
Thank you for starting with me, but I'll defer first to Dr. Welton, who's done this much more recently than I.
Okay, fine. So we'll go that way.
That's a good question. So I definitely wasn't viewing it as this is something that's going to be forever for the rest of my life. My goal when I finish residency is to never have to work on Shabbos. That's still my ultimate goal, Shabbos and Yantiv. As an OBGYN, if you want to deliver your own patients, it's not likely to happen, but it's still, if it's possible to join a practice where you can, that still would be like number one for me. I think when you talked about going into residency programs, like for me I knew that in OBGYN, and I asked around a lot from OBGYNs and people who also did fellowships and were not in accommodating fellowship programs. And my Rav also, and actually multiple rabbis I asked when it came to like applying, and they did say it's possible to get a Shomer Shabbos program 100%. There was nothing at all in OBGYN. There was one program that was like really, really like the bottom of my list. And I was like, maybe I'm like overqualified. And I tried to like bargain with them. And I was like, I'll rank you first, even though it was like really like way down at the bottom. And I like was not, but I was like, it's worth it if I can get Shabbos off. Cause like you said, it really is like, Shabbos is our whole essence as Jewish people, and we keep the Shabbos, Shabbos keeps us. And it's like, and my husband is a shul rabbi, and my kids are growing up with like, my mother's not around on Shabbos. So it was really a big factor, but they said no, this other program, they were like, we can't do that, even though like, we'd be happy for you to rank us. So at that point, it was just like, okay, it's just between all the, they're all the same. They're all not, it's not like one, I'm going to get more Shabbos or less Shabbos. So I don't really like see it as this is going to be like my best life. It's not my best life. I hate working on Shabbos. It's really hard, but I think, if you're in a place, when you look at places and you can see the type of people that you're working with, you can see if you're going to be with accommodating types of people. When they say, okay, we try give you wellness days, we try to give you, for weddings, for things like that, you can ask about high holidays. I don't think it's unreasonable. My program always makes a point to give us off high holidays, even when you're like on night shifts. I get off like Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, because of the meaningful, element of the day. So, it's not something that I don't think it's conducive to the life I want to live. It's an oxymoron. I don't want, it's not my best life, but it's a temporary life to eventually get to my best life. If that answers the question.
Yeah, I mean, if OB-GYN is something that you're passionate about and you want to do, then, I think this is something that Rabbi Willig touched upon, that not all of us can really be radiologists. Not all of us can go into the fields of medicine that are conducive for Shabbos. But it's a difficult decision to make and say, yeah, I'm willing to sacrifice that and work my best way to get to that point where I can live the best life.
When it came to choosing a specialty, I asked my Rav, and he said, this is something that you've always wanted to do, that you have a passion for. I was a doula before I was a doctor, and I knew I was really interested in women's health and labor and delivery. And so it was just something that was like a defining aspect. I wasn't going to med school and then keeping my broad eye open and deciding. It was like, this is what. So in that case, he said like, this is the part of your mission. And I have it a little bit easier also because it's life and death. And so you really are like every, night you're on the labor floor, anything could happen, and you really are doing emergencies. It's a little bit easier than other specialties in that way.
Dr. Rubin, thoughts? Yonah?
So I would start by first just reiterating, especially since a few people have come on since, what you started by saying, which is that this is a decidedly non-halachic discussion. And I would add to that if anything I say implies a specific halachic opinion, please don't go by that and speak to your LOR, and we'll talk about that too. So the decision of how to rank programs and how to choose a Shomer Shabbos or non-Shomer Shabbos program is extremely personal. How it relates to your life also obviously depends on your life situation and where you're thinking of going and living, and how it relates to where your family is. But I think chief among this is where you and your Rav and in your religious opinion you think Shabbos is. So if Shabbos is the number one consideration for your residency, then that's a different story than if you think that if your halachic position is that you're not obligated to try to get a Shomer Shabbos program by all means necessary, and that you can have other considerations such as different features of different programs or location or other things. And so if you are of that mindset, then it's another consideration to consider with everything else, which also will itself vary by field and by residency program. And I think, I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit more about how to deal with the specifics or research the specifics, but obviously, especially in an increasingly competitive residency market, it's impossible to fully investigate and understand the details of how Shabbos switches would happen in any different, and make your rank list accordingly. Also, there's a practical component to this too. So I think it really starts by making that bifurcation point. If your first decision point is Shabbos or no Shabbos, it's a very different pathway than if your decision point is not Shabbos versus no Shabbos. And I think I'll leave it there.
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, it's important to just consider that the Shabbos is obviously in not just the keeping of Shabbos that we all want to keep Shabbos, but also lifestyle. I think Dr. Welton, you were alluding to that as well, and it's something that a lot of the posting brought up, is that that's an important factor to keep in mind. So that being said, even if one decides I want to go into surgery, which unfortunately I would say I'm plagued with the surgery bug. So I think about this quite often. And you want to, there are no real programs that actually accommodate Shabbos. It's really unheard of. I imagine for OBGYN, you had a similar experience. So therefore you want to kind of work your way within the system. It doesn't formally exist. It doesn't even exist off the table, but perhaps you can maximize how many Shabbosim you can get off. So how early do you both suggest starting the process? Because bringing up on an interview is a difficult thing. It's difficult that you're trying to say, I want to be the best candidate, but at the same time, you're giving them an obvious limitation. I will say, as like part of the JPN, and our greater goal is to alleviate some of that pressure. And we have plans of doing so, but likely that would be like really far in the future. And right now, there are applicants who have to deal with this issue. Did you discuss Shabbos on the interview? What was maybe like a benchmark of thinking I should bring it up or I shouldn't bring it up? I imagine certain programs are easier to bring it up with. And how did it go over?
Sure. So I did not bring up Shabbos. I knew that I was applying to non-Shomer Shabbos programs. And I think programs in general know that there's Shabbos and that there's Shomer Shabbos programs out there, and that there are non-Shomer Shabbos programs. Of course, that also depends that varies by field. So it's sort of a given when you're applying to a non-Shomer Shabbos program that you're going to be working on Shabbos. So I don't think it's like the onus is on, I wouldn't advise going to a non-Shomer Shabbos program and trying to get them to guarantee you any sort of Shabbos accommodation. I do have a whole bunch of advice that we can talk about on how to, once you're in a program, how to maximize Shabbos and Yontif arrangements once you're there. But I in my view, the time to do that is not on the interview. Like the interview trail is not for negotiating a new Shabbos pathway for a non-Shomer Shabbos program. But again, that could also vary by fields. I was in internal medicine. There's a lot of Shomer Shabbos talk. I don't know how much Shomer Shabbos talk there is in OBGYN. So it could be that program directors aren't aware of this, and that sometimes in these fields, maybe they are willing to talk about it. I guess I can only speak for internal medicine. The only time Shabbos came up on an interview was when I was interviewing with a program director who herself was an Orthodox Jewish person, who brought up to me in front of a couple of non-Jewish co-applicants that they will not be offering Shabbos, and also also not recommended when you're program directors to do that.
So for your general rule was don't bring it up on interviews, not a time to discuss it. Even I'm not also, I want to clarify, not in terms of making a deal, right? Obviously asking for a guarantee of anything, but even just kind of casually bringing it up and saying, I would ideally like to be offered Shabbos and I would love, to maybe work something out, kind of being like, that's how I would do it for jobs, nothing medically related.
Understand. No, I think like for anything else, there's no general rule, and it requires a lot of balance and judgment. You don't want to come across to, residency is competitive, right? And if they think that you're already trying to cut corners and get deals, it's just not going to be, it's probably not going to count to your favor. At the same time, the residency application and interview process is long and pretty drawn out. It's much longer than fellowship. And so there's time during that process to meet other people, talk to other people within the division. It could be that like you're being interviewed by someone who completely understands and you feel comfortable having a completely open and honest conversation. You might not have that benefit in other programs. So it's something you have to play by ear and use good judgment. And if you're not sure, better not, generally, I would say.
I would love to get Dr. Welton's opinion on this, but one unique thing, I know, Dr. Rubin, you did spend some time in Boston, right? Did you, I would imagine that in New York, being that it's so well known, you have proponents and opponents, meaning like if a program's not offering it, they're not offering it. I wonder if out of state you experienced anything different.
I can tell you, I mean, on my fellowship trail, I was not bringing up Shabbos with any programs. And there actually are a couple that will guarantee Shabbos if you want it in pulmonary and critical care. But it did when once I matched, then I spoke to my program and I went through all the things that we can sort of outline how to approach things, and it was pretty new, I could tell, but everyone was extremely understanding and accommodating as much as they can within reason.
Okay. Dr. Welton, thoughts?
I would echo honestly the same thing. I wouldn't bring it up on the interview. It's not the time or place. And again, like once you're in a program and comfortable and have a relationship and are offering to cover other people, and people see that you're, flexible when they need, that I think that's more the time to try for switching. And I know we'll cover that later. Yeah. My program brought it up to me as well, because it's just we're in the 5 towns and there's so many Jews, and half of the program are, just they know what's up. So they mentioned it too. And they said we don't have any Shomer Shabbos to offer you. And I said, I know, but I'm lucky because it's like a life-saving, environment. It's okay.
Right. That definitely helps. So that being said, we can, fast forward a little bit. We're not bringing it up on interviews, at least, based on the advice we're getting so far, which means the best way to work things out is once you're in the program. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about like scheduling. It seems like that's kind of different between hospital systems and between residencies. And I can safely say, as a third-year medical student, I do not know a lot about the scheduling system. Maybe you can both talk about your experiences with the scheduling system, who developed your schedule, and how you can preemptively make a switch, or a Yontif is coming and you want to be on high alert for that. Like what you can do. So who maybe you could take us a little bit through that process. How far in advance is the schedule is made? Who makes the schedule? Who can you go to if you want to, fix a scheduling conflict with the Yontif? Anyway, any takers?
Sure. I think this is like the most important point for people to come away with. And I don't think anything I'm about to say is groundbreaking. It's probably intuitive, but it might be something that you don't think about until you do it. So I'll just walk you through, because I've done this now for 6 years. The first thing I would say, obviously, is that the details of like who makes your schedule and how far in advance will vary by field and will vary by institution. And once you match in a place, the best person to speak to is someone 1 year ahead of you in that residency program. And whether they're Jewish or not, or Orthodox or not, anyone can walk you through. Everyone knows in nauseating detail everything that they need to know about how to organize their schedules and who makes it. Generally, it's run by chief residents. And what I think you want to do is, the practical way of the best thing to do is to avoid issues, right? And you best do that by avoiding Shabbos and avoiding Yontif. And so I think the most important thing to do, first of all, is get your schedule as soon as possible. As soon as you mentioned preemptive, and that's the key word. Like in the very beginning of the year, like right now, if you're starting a residency, if you haven't yet, look through the calendar and look through and every Shabbos that you're on. And sometimes it's going to be much harder to get Shabbos generally, because weekends are already tighter staffing, but then also Yontif. And like right now, you should be working out your coverage for Shavuos. And the way you do this is by understanding all the different rotations and what the requirements are. There's some, depending on your field, there are some blocks. Usually things are divided into blocks. There's some blocks that are lighter, where it'll be much easier for you to be home on Yontif. There's some blocks where you're going to be expected to be on 24-hour call every 2 days or something like that. And again, it will vary by your rotation. So you ideally would, as best as possible, want your blocks the lighter blocks to be covering, September, October, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. You really have to look at the dates. And I learned the hard way. If you Google the dates of Sukkot, and you just Google dates of Sukkot, it will not include Sukkot Pasora and Shmini Atzeres, because they know that it's a Yontif B'fnei Atzma. They're really smart. So I almost scheduled myself for working on Yontif thinking that Sukkot has ended. But use a Jewish calendar, I guess. But so let me just back up 1 second, is that usually when you start, the chief residents or whoever's scheduling will email you in advance of that year and say, hey, we're starting the new schedule for the interns. And they know people have weddings planned or events or something. So they ask you what months you really want off. And you'll say, well, September and April and also July. And, so it's going to be a problem, but you try as best as possible to already at that point, get the best schedule that's going to fit for your Yontif. And then you'll get a schedule, and some things will work out and some won't. And that's when you get your first schedule and you start looking at what makes the most sense. And the first thing you could generally do are entire block switches. Other people who made similar schedule requests also got some of their requests and some of them who didn't, and somebody might be willing to switch with you, right? And so what you want to do, and what I would recommend not doing, which I think I see happen all the time and it always fails, is a spamming of your entire residency. You say, hey, is anyone interested in switching blocks with me? And no one's going to read that email, right? What you want is a targeted email. This is true for blocks and this is true for individual days. You want a targeted email. You find someone who is on the block that you want, who in, Rosh Hashanah time is on the light block, and, in some other month, you're on the light block, and you say, hey, any chance, totally say no, but any chance you would be interested in just switching these two blocks, I'll take this block and you'll take this block, and like a very specific proposal, and wait for them to answer. And they'll answer you because it's a targeted email. They see that you tried there, you did all the work. They just have to say yes, no. And if people don't care, they generally don't care. And if they care, they care. And then that's it. And don't pressure them and say, well, my religion, like, obviously, I think that goes without saying that, your considerations don't really matter to them and shouldn't necessarily. So that's how I would like arrange block switches. And it's the same thing for individual day switches. So once you're stuck on whatever your rotation is, if you have to understand again how your schedule works, but say like, hey, like this is one Shabbos, I'm working this week. Can I switch this with this other person? Find a person you can switch with. You also have to know, in order to do this, what the rules are in your program. So for example, in my residency, no one really cared if you switched an individual day or not. So if I was working, a black weekend, which is, Shabbos Sunday, and somebody else was working a golden weekend, and I just switched my Sunday for their Shabbos, they wouldn't care, in general, if it worked out. In my fellowship, they felt that if you were, that the person who was on for the weekend for continuity of care purposes, for patient care, it should be a full weekend or not a full weekend. So there was nothing to talk about, right? So you just had to understand, you could switch entire blocks, or you could switch entire weekends if one weekend made more sense, or one weekend was also Yom Kippur or something like that. Which also just reminds me, and I'm sorry, this is a little out of order, but like Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, in my view, there's really no excuse for people not to try to work out. At least first day Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, like it's one thing to like try to get Simchas Torah and Shmini Atzeres and Shavuos and the holidays that people have never heard of. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are 3 days, and it's important, if you want to prioritize those two, that you make that clear to the program. These are the most important ones. If you say, hey, I have 20 days a year, then they won't, then they might not take any of them with great importance. But if you tell them like, this is Yom Kippur, this is Rosh Hashanah, this is, really important, I think, in general, that will go over well too.
So just because that was something I was going to bring up in terms of like prioritizing, obviously you can ask for 52 Shabbosim, but it's easier to pick Yom Tovim first. But I'm happy you brought it up. So just real quick, is that something you mentioned that they would reach out even before setting blocks? What's important to you? Is that something you would bring up then right off the bat, similar to like if you knew you had a wedding coming up, you would say, well, these 3 holidays are of most important. So you're saying at that stage already.
Yeah, and usually they don't really, at that point when they're setting the schedule, they don't even really care about your reasons. They're just trying to, they understand everyone has different reasons for why they want. So they just want to know what is your most important schedules. You could usually free text or just tell people like, hey, this is the most important. If they tell you to choose top 3 and you say like, honestly, I don't even care about those top 2. I really only, you could, at that point, you're a member of the residency, right? You're going to be a good citizen. There's human beings who are like on your team who are there to cheer. It's a very different landscape than when you're like applying and they don't even know if they're going to go there, and they might not want, and no one might want to deal with a headache. And the main thing I would say also that hopefully is coming through all this is that the last thing you want to do is create a headache, right? If you are respectful and you are prospective and you do all the legwork and you say, look, this is a very simple switch. Can we do this? And if a no is no, then that's it. That's completely appropriate. Right. And even if you do it a lot, it's appropriate, but it's if there's a sense of entitlement or demanding, then I think that's gonna change it for, first of all, future Orthodox applicants, but also for yourself, and probably not going to be successful either.
Yeah, definitely. I hadn't even thought of that whole switching the whole block. So I'm like
debating now.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think one of the things that like you just mentioned is like that you do the legwork. I think that's a really key part of it, because I think at least in my program, we have like an admin chief who's like the 4th year resident who does all the scheduling, and it's got to be like the worst job in the world. Like I can't even, it's just like, it's so tight. And it's like, if one person's on Saturday and the next person's on Sunday, like you can't switch. It's just so hard to even envision how you can switch even a single day. We're 3 residents a year. So it's really tight. And so I think like finding that person in advance, I've never done the whole blocks, but like the individual switches of like finding that person in advance who is willing to switch and you're willing to switch. And also for us, we have to keep in mind like that there's an appropriate level of each like resident, so that you have a 4 and a 3 and a 2, or if it's a Saturday 24 call, or it's like because you can't have like 2 interns and a 2 for like a whole Saturday shift. So it's like that's also, so just making sure like when you do the legwork and you find someone who's willing to switch with you, that like all of that kind of checks out, and you'll learn as you like get accustomed to your program's rules and all of that. But yeah, presenting it to the admin chief and say, hey, like we did this, does this look okay to you? Like if we make this switch, is it, and like if everything checks out, like there really shouldn't be a problem. Yeah, and again, yeah, I echo the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. For my program, they have a specific rule that like you cannot take any vacations when you're on night shift and your night flow block is assigned to you. And I was on for night shifts, but it's the significance of the day. And so you just, so I asked a fellow resident, can I switch and, do your Saturday night instead, when we never do Saturday nights. It's just like a Saturday 24. And they, and the program was totally accommodating. And I think, those are really significant days. And again, also just keep bearing in mind when other people might want to switch, I don't care, Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year, all those things. And so I would always, if somebody had something that was important to them, and, you have your priorities. And again, like you mentioned, the actual admin chief doesn't care about the reasons, but, when you show people that you care about their personal things also, it's just nice.
Be a mensch is what I'm walking away with.
Yeah, I'd continue to add, just because I think this is probably the most helpful part of this. I think this is the most practical part of what we're talking about. I just wanted to piggyback on a few things that you just brought up, which is also, first of all, just to reiterate that the farther in advance you do this, the more successful you'll be, because you have more people to choose from, and they have more, and there's just so much more wiggle room. And in general, once a switch, there's usually like a Bible schedule. It's usually on a website called Amion, which is amion.com. Amion. I could still look up my residency schedule because it's just like one password always. It's kind of fun. But once it's in there, it's set. Like once you agree to a switch, you generally, this is at least how it was in my residency and fellowship, you agree to a switch, it gets set in the schedule, and then it's over. If anybody wants to switch back, or it's kind of set at that point, and it's not something that you necessarily need to or will be required to do. The other thing that I think Dr. Welton sort of alluded to or mentioned also is that, there's Christmas and New Year's. And these are things that like where you have an opportunity to show that, you're not, that you're legitimate, that you're saying these are what's important to me and not that. And I'm asking people to help accommodate me so that, so that I should equally, right, show that I would like to accommodate what's important to them. And in general, if you're someone who's taking off Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Yontif, I would submit that you're probably not really, that Christmas and New Year's are not as important to you. And like those are great opportunities to offer and volunteer and say, hey, let's switch for that, and to show that you're willing to do your part. And I think it was powerful that Chavi, you mentioned a specific example. So I just wanted to share another one that you reminded me of, which was that we had, like, for example, we had a week also of night shifts, and they would actually, you would always get one night off, which was Friday night, which was perfect for me, obviously. And the reason why you were off is because somebody else who was on outpatient was covering you. So when it was my turn to cover someone on a Friday night, I asked the person if they didn't mind if I covered their Saturday night instead. And they actually preferred having Saturday night off, because then you get like the full Saturday, Sunday weekend. So it was a win for them. It was a win for me. And it was like, and nobody cares. The whole point was just to make sure that you had one day off in 7. Nobody cares which day it was. And it's like a perfect example of an easy switch. Sometimes it's obviously more complicated, but that's all.
So I'm going to continue on with the questions. I just want to, let people know who may have joined after. You can jump in at any time, ask your questions. I don't love the sound of my own voice, though it may seem so. You're more than welcome to ask a question. If you don't feel comfortable, I am monitoring the chat. You can always put a question in the chat and I'd be happy to bring it up. That being said, unless there's something that any of you want to add, we can move on with some of the questions. So you mentioned in terms of how to switch and kind of the best way to be proactive about it. If you did not intervene at all, what would you say is the likelihood that you're going to end up working on Shabbos and Yontif? How stuck would you be if, let's say, none of your switches worked, you were totally not preemptive at all, like how stuck are you baseline and how much do you have to really maneuver? We calculate there's around 52 weeks of Shabbos, and I think there's like 13 days in total if you're counting like major Yom Tovim. How stuck would you be, and how often, I guess, to tack onto that, how often do you feel like you can maneuver around? How much of that are you able to kind of get out of? I forgot who went first last time.
Hey, I can do this one. I think for me, it comes down a lot more to Yontif than Shabbos. My program has the way our call schedule works is that we have like a night flow system. So we have you'll do like either a Friday 24-hour where you work just like Friday and through Friday night and you're off Shabbos morning, or a Saturday 24 or a Sunday 12. And that's like if you're working a weekend. And sometimes you'll do the Friday 24 and a Sunday 12. But most of the time not. So it's very, very hard to get out of a Saturday 24 because there's nowhere else that you're doing. Nobody wants to do a Friday, like a Saturday 24 for a Friday 24 when you're anyways working Friday during the day and it's just an extra 12 hours. So that it's sometimes possible if like somebody has something really important to them that they want to be at. And so then I'm able to switch. Like I'll say, hey, I'll do 2 of your Fridays if you do the Saturday, if they have like a Friday night wedding, or things like that. But I would say it's very uncommon for me to be able to switch a Saturday 24. For Yontifs though, 100%. If we didn't intervene, I would just be working like every Yontif. You get to choose your vacations a little bit earlier each year in my program. And I think that a lot of programs it's similar where it gets sent to the 4th years first, then the 3rd years, then the 2nd year. So, this year, every year you get to choose a little bit more and you can get more Yontifs. But, aside from that, if I wouldn't intervene, I wouldn't get any Yontifs off.
So Yontif would be a much larger issue than Shabbos.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I think this would completely vary by field and residency. So it's really impossible to answer, but it did remind me to bring in a couple of quick important points, I think, which is the first that, remember that like once you're in this program, like that you should certainly focus on trying to figure this all out, especially at the front end, like we were talking about. But remember that like your primary job is to be a resident, is to get an outstanding training. You could talk to your Rav about your halachic obligations to be outstandingly trained. And once you're in it, not to be distracted by like don't make the focus of your residency not to work. Even, to get out of work, it could just change your entire year, your entire residency in many ways. And it's just important not to lose sight of why you're doing a residency, whether you wanted to do a non-Shomer Shabbos or whether you really tried not to. Like ultimately you're in a residency to become an amazing doctor. Like Chavi said at the beginning, it's time limited, and just don't let that ruin everything for you. The second point is don't call in sick when you're not. Like it's extremely obvious and it's embarrassing, and it will hurt you and it will hurt people who come after you. And the last thing is that when you are, this is kind of similar to my first point, but it's like when you're actually in the hospital on Shabbos or whatever, it's also important to keep in mind what I was saying originally, but for the day too. Your focus in residency is to be a good resident, and your focus on any given day is to be a good resident and to be a good doctor and to make sure that things are done and not to be focusing on getting out. And if it's unpleasant to be in the hospital on Shabbos, but once you're there, if your focus is to get out, it will impact your work, it will impact your patient, it will impact your ability to be a part of the residency team. And you really have to, and it's hard because especially, like depending on who your Rav is, if you're going to go home and like, unless there's like a little bit amount of time, you're just like, well, if there, there's temptations, and you really just need to focus on what you're doing as if it's not Shabbos, and then see where you are when it's time to go and deal with it that way. Talk more about that.
Just to even like strengthen that is that the whole, at least, and this is also going to depend on what your discussion with your Rav is and what your whole, if you're doing Shem Shabbos or not. But for me, it was the whole reason for being able to do this on Shabbos is because you are, you're training to be a doctor. You're training, it's the whole I'm so sorry, like blanking out, like to say like pikuach nefesh, right? And so like if you're just sitting there thinking like, oh, I could be home, or like, oh, I need to like run down and make kiddush before I eat anything, and so like I'm gonna like starve and I'm about to go into this emergency surgery, like you're not doing your patients a favor. You're actually like not in a way keeping that form of Shabbos. Like this is what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be saving a life on this Shabbos, or you're supposed to be doing this patient care. And so it's like, if you're just kind of cutting corners and you're just like, okay, wait, I'm not going to type this handoff or write this down because it's like I can just verbally say it. That's not the safest thing for your patients, and it's like you're doing worse by being in the hospital at that point. Whereas like in reality, your whole like reason you can even be in the hospital is in order for that patient care. So you really want to make it, make the most of it. And yeah.
That's a really good point. And I actually want to piggyback off of you again, because you just remind me of, I know we're not dealing with anything halachic, but I will be this, I believe Rabbi Willig is the official posek of JPN. Is that correct?
We don't
kidding.
have yeah.
I'm just kidding. But Rabbi Willig is my Rav, and who I spoke to about everything. One of the things that I asked him, not that I was ever planning on doing this, but and I think this also drives home Chavi's point. But one of the things I asked him among our many conversations was, can I call in sick on Shabbos? If it is Shabbos morning, and obviously if you're sick, then yes. But if you're not sick and you wanted to play a game, which you absolutely should not do, and the answer is no, because you're not helping anybody. Right? You go to work, you go to the hospital, and you do your life-saving work all day, and you're not Mechal Shabbos. The minute you make a call that it wasn't necessary, that's Chil Shabbos. And I believe I believe that is what Rabbi Willig said. I think that's obvious, but it's not from me. But you can always verify that from the primary source.
So just because we kind of delved a little bit into the halachos of it, and again, the point of the session is not to give halachic advice, but I think it's fair game to quote the halacha advice we have been given. And I would refer to a conversation that we had. We have the video up with Rabbi Dr. Apple, which really echoes this, both of what you're both saying in terms of, if you're working on Friday and Shabbos is approaching, but you're with a patient, there's no excuse to like patient abandonment, like no excuse for any of that, and that really follows through. And a lot of the heterim we've talked about various things, we're also relying on the fact that you shouldn't have to worry. And so I don't want to say more. I don't want to start poskening for people, but we have some great videos out by some really educated people who give real great answers, and I highly recommend checking out those videos, because I think that will bring a lot of clarity to the actual halachic component of this. We're not talking about that today. So the other side of this conversation, the halacha, and I think a lot of that has been discussed really well. Someone did ask, and I'll ask both of you. If you don't feel comfortable, that's fine, but I will bring it up because someone did ask. As we mentioned, it's important to have a Rav, specifically a Rav who is competent to answer medical halachic questions. How did the two of you approach that topic? It can be difficult to find a Rav. That's something that JPN kind of echoes, that we want to promote people to find the right Rav and to find one early, to really ask questions as early as possible. How did the two of you kind of go about that?
I think for me, I was lucky in that I kind of knew this Rav before outside of like medical questions. And then he just happens to also be an expert in the field of medicine. So I already kind of had that relationship. But I think for like main thing for me is that somebody who's really accessible, because your schedule is just super crazy. And you're not necessarily going to have like a block of time that's going to fit, that you can like call and have a sit down conversation about every question. Like so many things come up, things that you don't even think would be a question until they come up. And for me, it was, Myra was like super accessible via WhatsApp. It sounds like we all have like the same Rav, but like super accessible.
I think so, yeah.
And like, like via WhatsApp, texting, someone that you feel comfortable with, that as things arise, you can just quickly, and someone who's familiar with medicine and with the questions that come up. And so that I'm not gonna have to sit and like be explaining in tremendous detail everything and wondering like, are they, so I think that's really key for those two things, and someone that you're comfortable with, and someone that you respect enough to be okay if it's not the answer that I like, or that's easy. This is someone who I have a relationship with and respect enough, and have been just talking to for long enough that this is, I trust that he's giving me this advice, and even though it's not easy, it's what I'm going to do. So I think,
Yeah, I completely agree. You need two things, and they're the exact things that were mentioned. You need a Rav who is an expert in your field, just like in medicine, right? You don't go to an ophthalmologist with your heart problems. right? And vice versa. So you need a Rav who is, and not all Rabbanim are, and it's important to recognize that. And not all, sometimes, just like sometimes doctors who aren't qualified will give medical advice that they're not qualified to give, sometimes a Rav will give advice that they're also not qualified to give. So it's just because someone's giving you advice also doesn't mean that they are necessarily an expert in that field. So you need to know that your Rav is an expert. And the most important thing, like Chavi was mentioning, is that the Rav has to be accessible. It's very nice if you want Rav Asher Weiss to answer every single one of your medical questions, but it takes time. And so if you have trouble finding such a person, that is difficult. So I think, it depends who you, if it depends on, on your circle and who you consider a Rav. But one thing you can do is go to someone who is a posek who is not accessible, but access them once to ask them who they would recommend who is accessible. Because most of these poskim have, their Talmidim who do have access to them, who are, their Moshe Yisro situation, who are like the lower level and like feeding the questions back when they need to. But if they're not accessible or they're not an expert, they won't be helpful for you. One thing that I would recommend is once you have a Rav, before you start, like arrange for like a 1 hour sit down meeting. And as best you can, everyone's situation will be different, where the hospital is, what your field is, the double doors to get into the hospital and the electric flushing urinals or toilets, right? But like have one sit down meeting and sort of just set the stage, go through all your whole list of specific questions, big questions and little questions. And you'll first of all have many answers that will give you some guidance. You'll also have a sense, I think, because it's like Chavi mentioned, and this is the last point that I'm going to get to, it's impossible to ask every question. But by having a session like this, I think you will get as best you can a sense to navigate, because even the most accessible Rav is not available to you in the hospital on Shabbos when you have this question that comes up, right? So the more information you have from them going in, the more you'll be able to do your best to do what's right in the moment. And that's all you can do. That's not halachic advice. That's just the reality. You cannot do better than your best when you're alone in the hospital on Shabbos. And then afterwards, go back and say, hey, this is what I did. What do you think for next time? Was that the right thing to do or not? But I think having that initial sit down meeting is really helpful. Not just for the specific details, but also for just getting as good a sense as possible of direction and priorities and what you should be focusing on. And even like one thing to sort of get straight, I think, is knowing what's a deraisa and what's a derabanan. And this is not, I'm not going to say what is and what isn't, but I don't think so. I don't think this constitutes as halachic advice, but that's like a very important bifurcation to discuss with your Rav. Like, I'll stop there.
I'll add my 2 cents from like what we've been trying to do as an organization. We have lots of content out there, and that's helpful for 2 things. That A, gives you a background, right? When you ask a question, the answer is going to be as good as your question. If you ask a bad question, you don't give background, the person doesn't understand exactly what you're answering, you're not going to get an answer. Watching the videos gives you the background and the content. I don't recall exactly if we discussed each scenario, what's their rice, what's their bottom, but a lot of ground is covered. So if you have time, and this is important to you, and I suggest in 4th year, when you do have a little bit more free time and you're right on the cusp of starting residency, go through the content. It will certainly give you a good background. So when you do have a sit down with a Rav, or a posek rather, you'll have an easier time having that conversation. Additionally, we've interviewed several poskim, and we have on our website a forum where you can ask questions. That will likely be a good segue into building a relationship. If you're not in an institution that has a posek or has a local Rav who answers questions, you can at least try for that. Even just a simple email thread of some questions you have now. I've seen it work where people have questions and then sort of slowly build a relationship, which is now a possibility because of the website. It's not something that I'm aware of, at least, that was available before, but I strongly recommend taking advantage of that if you're having a hard time finding someone. That would be my 2 cents.
I completely agree with you. I just want to like add one example of like what important context is, right? You can ask a Rav, do I have to take the stairs or take the elevator? But you can also explain that if your entire team is rounding and is taking the elevator and you're taking the stairs, that's important context that changes the picture dramatically. Really important. Great point. Thank you for adding that.
Okay, so shifting back a little bit more to the clinical side of things, and we'll kind of wrap up. Can you tell us a little bit about the attending life? The goal is really to get out of residency life, to get out of, being on Shabbos. What can you expect? What kind of challenges still remain, if any, as an attending? Like, what are you looking in terms of your long-term career? What can people expect? Because knowing the outcome definitely changes, the short-term difficulties.
Yeah, I was preparing to stop talking because I feel like I've said too much, and now you ask an attending only question, I guess. But I would say that like anything else, right, this is something that's extremely specific on your field. What I would say is that, having just gone through this process, right, is that it's the first time in a long time that you're not going through a match, and you are, depending on what you're offering and how in demand and your skill set is, you can still negotiate, and this is a time where you can discuss Shabbos and Yontif. You can also be very upfront and say, these are some considerations. You could be upfront about whether it is or isn't. At this point, they're not worried that they're going to match you and then get stuck with you. You're having conversations and you get to the bottom of it, and then they either hire you or they don't. And so it's a very different landscape. It's much more simple to navigate, but there are certain fields that, depending on what you're doing, you might not be able to get Shabbos off, but that's too, I think, field specific. But for those of you who are even in fields that are very Shabbos friendly in residency, you should realize that there's generally more options when you're attending. And the other point to add to that is that even within fields, generally, once you graduate residency, most fields have a wide range of different, like OBGYN, right, comes to mind, a wide range of things you could do after. You could be doing surgery all day, every day, or not so much. And similarly in pulmonary and critical care, you could be a pulmonologist or an intensivist, and you could be inpatient or outpatient or academic or non-academic. You could open a private practice or not. So there are many different ways to build an attending career around, what you think is most important.
Dr. Welton, any thoughts?
I'm not attending yet, so I don't know. That sounds good.
do your attendings, do you have any firm attendings where you are that do any of them seem to have trouble with Shabbos or Yontif or?
I do. They still come for their patients on Shabbos. Like I said, I think for my field, it's a little bit, it's like a little bit easier in a way, because you're literally delivering a baby, you're going home. So right. It's, and even when I worked as a doula, I was going with my clients on Shabbos, because it's anybody to support a laboring woman. It's like a much wider, zone for breaking Shabbos. Or keeping Shabbos in that way that you're supporting them. So, I think the ones that I know do, but they try not to, as much as possible. You join a group, you try to make your schedules for when you're on call to be not on Shabbos. But if you have a patient that's really, important to them, they want you to deliver them, and that's the whole reason they came to you. So then they'll come in for them.
Okay. I think that's, in terms of content, I think we covered most things. I will open the floor up to questions. If anyone, had a question, didn't want to ask while we are middle, feel free to speak up now, put it in the chat. If not, we have a nice question to kind of round things out all the way. Okay, doesn't seem like there's too much activity. So what's something that simple, what's something you wish you knew before starting residency? It could be anything. It could be, what's something you wish you knew about your field? What's something you wish you knew about scheduling, halachic problems? What's something that you may not have anticipated early on? And if you knew that there was a student who was about to embark on the exact same journey you want to give some advice? Any thoughts? So it could be a tough question, I know. Perfect. So that means that school prepared you perfectly. That's good to know. What schools did you go to?
I think everyone tells you it's going to be so hard, and you're like, yeah, I can handle it. Okay. And then you're just like, whoa. So I think just kind of I think one thing I would have told myself in medical school, but it's hard to say looking back, you always say
right.
You look back and everything was so easy. Oh, step 2, it wasn't that bad. After it's over, but you don't know what it would have been had you not put in all those hours. But I was a Shabbos studier, and I would study a lot on Shabbos, and I would, go by Moshe Tandler, so you could study on Shabbos, it's like the Rambam, and you're studying medicine and whatever. So I think I would, just for a family life, I think I would have tried to study a little bit less on Shabbos when I was in medical school. Just knowing that those few extra hours that you're going to have of that Shabbos with your family, and knowing how many Shabbos you're going to give up if you're in a non-Shomer Shabbos program. Like in the end of the day, it like really doesn't matter. Those few extra times you like went over the Krebs cycle or whatever, like it's not, but like those memories that that's what you're going to lean on when you're in the hospital on Shabbos. And it's like, your spouse is lighting candles for you or whatever it is. It's just like emotionally, I think that's an important takeaway. Sometimes you have to study on Shabbos and it's for the same goal, but
you're saying your Shabbos mental health counts. Is that?
Yeah.
I would just reiterate what I had said earlier and say that it doesn't just apply to Shabbos, and just remember that it's time limited. And also remember that if your goal is to not be there, you will have a miserable time, right? And try to remember why you decided you want to be a doctor and why you're doing this, and own it and be there, and don't try to not be there. Just try to focus on just doing the best you can and just ignore the hard days, because there will be some. And I, instead of offering something new there, I wanted to just share one piece of general advice that I asked. One of the last questions I asked Rabbi Willig after our sit down was sort of this question, like, do you have any like general broad advice for Shabbos? And he said, yes. And this was actually extremely impactful. He said, when you go in on Shabbos, you should wear your jacket, your tie, and your hat. And I said, Rabbi Willig, a hat? And he said, you don't have to wear a hat. But until COVID, I did. And then,
Really?
laundry and stuff. And it really, if there's, it's very easy to forget where you are, but if you're wearing scrubs every day and on Shabbos, you're wearing your white shirt and pants, maybe you're not wearing a couple of times I got mistaken for the attending. You come in with a jacket and a tie. Like people are like talking to me instead of the attending. But it framed it just created a different environment. And the one time I actually went on Shabbos in medical school, it was one time I spoke to Rabbi Willig about it. He told me this advice, and when I came in, they're like, "Why are you wearing that?" And I was like, "Oh, it's Shavuos. It's like a Jewish holiday. Like you should go home after rounds." I was like, "Thank you."
Okay.
That won't happen in residency, I guarantee it. But you should still. But I'm not saying anyone should do that. But it was just helpful advice to help just remember when you're doing all the things you're doing, especially if you're not able to do a shinoi with everything or whatever it is, that you just it helps you feel different.
Totally. One thing I'll add also is like that, you think you're alluding to this a lot, of like being happy to be there and recognizing that like this is where you're meant to be, and just own it. And I think for me that's a big part of like Shabbos in the hospital. So I'm lucky that I have a lot of from patients, and I have patients coming in all the time to give birth on Shabbos, and we're wearing matching tichels, and it's like so exciting, and our kids go to school together, and or someone's my neighbor and they're like, okay, what's the parsha, maybe we'll name our kids, like after. And it's like I still get that taste of Shabbos a lot. Last Saturday I was actually on, and we had an emergency C-section, and literally at the end of the section, we're like putting the tape, pulling the drape off, and me and the anesthesiologist and the doctor, all Jewish, and we're just like Baruch Shema ben Kodesh L'chol, and we're like in the OR, and like it was just like it's things like that you realize like this is where I'm meant to be right now. Like Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere, and like you carry that with you, and what you're doing for your patients is huge, and you're doing Hashem's work. And so just like keeping that in mind throughout, however, hard it is, that this is what you're meant to be doing right now. And you're doing it in like the best way that you can, with all the considerations, listening to your Rav, and like bearing in mind, whether it's the steps or the elevator, everything, like it's really holy work, and the holiness is in the details. So.
Wow. Really, truly, thank you both so much for your time. I can only imagine how valuable it actually is. I really appreciate the time. I think I imagine our viewers enjoy it as well. I'm getting a lot of thank you messages. So thank you both. And I'm looking forward to sharing this. And I'm sure we're going to help a lot of students and incoming residents along their journey.